Welcome to Season 6, Episode 7 of Fire Away, Rudner Law's online show focused on the employment law issues that matter to you. My name is Brittany Taylor. I am an employment lawyer, partner at Rudner Law, and your host of this episode of Fire Away. Fire Away streams live online every month, and if you missed an episode or want to watch one again, they are always available on our YouTube channel, Facebook page, and on our website. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Catherine Connelly, Professor of Organizational Behavior at the DeGroote School of Business, to talk about her research on non-standard workers, her book, and other work the Connelly Laboratory for Organizational Behavior Research is doing. Let's get into it. Catherine, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Very, very excited to have you here. So the first question I want to ask you, because your book, Enduring Work, essentially analyzes the Canadian Temporary Foreign Worker Program from both the employer and employee perspective. I'm going to be a total journalist here, put my journalist hat on. I'm just really curious. Tell me about the title. Why did you call it Enduring Work?
Oh, yeah. So the title Enduring Work comes from, there's sort of two sides to it. So on the one hand, it's about the misperception about the temporary foreign worker program. A lot of people think these workers are temporary, and actually often they're not. So you will meet temporary foreign workers who have been in Canada 20 years, right? So it's an enduring program. And sometimes when the workers are kind of done, they're replaced with another temporary worker. So it's not that the work is temporary. It's not that the workers are temporary. The work is definitely enduring. But then the flip side is, unfortunately, sometimes these workers endure a lot. And they're often very pleased to be in Canada. They're hoping to become Canadian citizens one day. And so because of that, they endure sometimes some pretty serious mistreatment, just in the hopes that they can make it work one day.
Right. I really like that. I always like titles that have multiple meanings behind them, but I think that's a really, really great jumping off point for the discussion that we're going to have today. But before we get into that and talking specifically about the experience of temporary foreign workers, I want to ask just really briefly for those that may not be familiar, if you can describe the temporary foreign worker program in Canada and kind of how it works.
Yeah, so Brittany, it's kind of a complicated program. So usually when I tell people, oh, it's a book about the temporary foreign worker program, people think it's mostly about agricultural workers. And that's a big part of the program, but it's not all of it. So we also have in-home caregivers. So these are nannies, people looking after grandparents, people with medical needs. And so that's another large group of the program, but there's two other streams. There's the low wage stream, which is people working a lot of food services, tourism, that sort of thing, and then a high wage stream. And these are health sciences, kind of healthcare workers, sometimes web developers, lawyers, I don't know, but yeah, it's a really varied program.
That's really interesting. And I would say that's probably one of, we had talked in our kind of prep meeting about some of the common misconceptions.
Yeah.
One of them being the temporary nature of the work, but the other one being that just the nature of the work and this idea that you're right. I think that if you were to ask the average person, they would assume you're mostly talking about agricultural work, but it's so varied in terms of the type of work that these individuals are being brought over to do.
Yeah, it's super varied. And the other thing is sometimes people think that, oh, the high wage workers are safe, like they're okay. We don't have to worry about them. And that it's only the agricultural workers that we need to worry about. But no, like they're all at risk, but in different ways. So even though the high wage workers, they're often highly educated, they're highly skilled. Normally they kind of know a lot about kind of how to navigate complicated systems. But because they have high wages, sometimes that makes them a bit of a target. And so their employer will say to them, oh, okay, I agree. We agreed that I'd pay you $35 an hour. Not going to do that anymore. It's just going to be 30, right? And so at that point, they're kind of stuck, and it's a huge cost saving to the employer. And I mean, it's wage theft. It's not allowed to happen, right?
Right.
But even though they're well educated, speak English and French really well, they're still vulnerable.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really important message to get across is that even you're right, these highly skilled, highly educated individuals are still facing the same concerns, the same issues. And this might seem kind of an obvious question, but I'd really like to get your take on it is why is it that these workers are so much more vulnerable than the average worker that we would consider in Canadian society?
Right. So the biggest difference that makes them more vulnerable than other low wage workers or other people that, I mean, are also exploited sometimes in the workplace, is they have what's known as a closed work permit. And so when they come, it's because the employer has filled out some paperwork and requested the permission from the government to hire this worker, right? And so this worker can go to this employer. Okay. And they can't just walk across the street like you or I, or at most Canadian, well, like any Canadian could do.
Right.
And even students who come, international students who come and work, they have open permits, they can go wherever. People in some of the other immigration streams, they don't have any closed work permits. It's just these 4 specific streams have this restriction on them. And so that's what makes them really vulnerable.
So with a closed work permit, an employee can't just, like you were saying, if the way that a Canadian citizen could do is vote with their feet by just moving on to the next job. It's really challenging for someone with a closed work permit to do that.
Yeah, it's technically possible, but it's complicated to do that. One of the recent changes is if there's abuse, then they are issued a temporary open permit just while everything gets sorted out. But with a lot of workers, they know right away that their supervisor is going to be a problem, right? That there's early warning signals. And so ideally, they'd be able to just get out while it's safe to do so and get out while the going's good. But they're cautious about that. They're trying to make it work. And so they stay and then something terrible happens.
Yeah, yeah. What advice could you give to employers who are interested in or are already using the program that what things could employers do to improve the experience of employees? And then for employers who maybe are not using the program but are thinking about it, what are some things that they could do kind of right off the bat to try and make this a less tenuous and scary situation for employees?
Yeah, so I'd say 2 things right off the bat for any company who's already using the program. One would be to partner up with a local community organization that supports new Canadians or immigrants or like any number of these community organizations. They are there to help, right? So they can have people come in, do nice presentations. There's workers there who can help your employees to get a library card and a bus pass and warm winter clothing and everything that they need, right? So they feel supported, they can connect them with other people in the same boat. It just gives them that sense of community and some very tangible, practical advice. And so the company doesn't have to do all of this all by themselves. There's community organizations that they can team up with, and they do this all the time, day in, day out. So they are fantastic at supporting employees. So yeah, so I'd say definitely recommend that. I think a second thing has to do more with the internal messaging, because a lot of companies have pretty good policies, right? But then something is just lost along the way, right? And so you end up with a supervisor who could be saying to a temporary foreign worker, you know what, cash your paycheck, come back, give me half, right? And so maybe that's not what the organization even knows that's happening. But I mean, of course, they're still responsible, right? And so if they don't want things like that to happen, they need to be abundantly clear in their training and their messaging that this is just not on. Sometimes it's less extreme cases, like making sure everybody gets their holiday pay, making sure there's no unpaid overtime, stuff like that, making sure just the contracts are fulfilled the way they're supposed to be. But yeah, companies need to be on this, especially if it's a larger organization and if they have a large number of workers coming through.
Yeah, so what strikes me about this is that both of these things that you're talking about, they don't require really organizations to do much more than they would already be doing, right? Like, so in the first example of reaching out to these kind of community support programs that are available, that burden is other than the reaching out, other than the getting involved, it allows organizations to kind of shift that onto these community support groups and take advantage of the resources that are already out there rather than reinventing the wheel, which is fabulous. But then even when we're talking about this kind of, look, you've got to have more than just a set it and forget it approach to things like employment agreements and policies. I mean, that's the case with anything to do with managing workers in the workplace, right? You can't just have an anti-harassment policy
Right.
and then never do anything to enforce it or implement it in the work environment. You've got to take steps to make sure that it's actually being followed for via training, via culture in the workplace, to make sure that this is actually the reality of what you're doing. So there's not actually that much more, which I think is another common misconception that we would find with something like a temporary foreign worker program, is this idea that there is so much more work to do. I don't know, is that something that you find as well, that there's this perception that there's just it's this really onerous thing?
Well, so there's a few issues there. So one is, I've noticed that companies who are using the temporary foreign worker program are sometimes really understaffed. Right. So they've been having trouble staffing positions probably for a while and nothing's worked. So then they thought, okay, I've heard good things about the temporary foreign worker program. And so that's the route they're taking. So I think sometimes the intentions are good, but then it just kind of falls apart because there's just not enough strategy or intentionality about how they're going to use the program. So I think sometimes they're just under the gun a little bit. So they kind of scramble and this is what happens. The other thing is, it is also a ridiculously complicated program.
Right.
And so every year it seems to get more and more and more complicated in terms of how to use it, the documentation that you need. And depending on what your business is, paperwork may not be your forte.
Right.
So I've had people say to me, look, I'm a landscaper. I have a landscaping company. I don't know about what I'm doing here and I don't want to mess it up. And so they'll scramble a little bit and then they'll hire an agency or a consultant instead of a lawyer. And so sometimes the advice they get is really terrible and expensive and terrible. And so they're trying to make the best of it, but it's just not working.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah, no, thank you for pointing that out. It definitely on the front end to get involved in the program, there is a substantial amount of work. It is a very complex system to get involved in. So I think that's really important to acknowledge. So I want to touch on what you were just mentioning, that this pitfall that a lot of employers can fall into of just using an agency and really trying to just offload most of this onto the agency and kind of washing their hands of it. But we've talked about how positive it can be to rely on community support organizations and get support that way. So how do employers decide? How do they know that the organization that they're going to be working with is one that's actually going to be supportive and helpful for the workers and assist them with the process versus maybe an agency that is I don't want to say taking advantage, but perhaps taking advantage of them?
Yeah, sometimes they are. So, I mean, these agencies, like, they're not supposed to charge the worker anything. They're not allowed to, but sometimes they do. And sometimes it's a ridiculous amount and they get nothing in return. One of the worst cases I came across was the worker was not allowed to contact the company's HR for anything. They had to go to this agency to ask about just routine questions that were HR. And like, well, you can't do that either. And in some cases, like the agency, it's the brother-in-law of the manager, right? So I think it's much easier to find something better than the worst cases that I've seen. Like it's just really bad. Yeah, I did speak with some companies. They would hire two agencies. So they'd hire one to do it and one to check.
Okay.
And there's this real like information asymmetry, right? Like you're hiring someone because you don't know about that topic.
Right.
And so it's really hard to know if they're doing a good job until you get to the end of the process. And if you're not happy with the outcome, I think sometimes people will just blame the government, but sometimes it's the process that they've undertaken.
Geez. Okay. Yeah. No, I can definitely see how that would be a challenge. And you're right. I mean, as an employer, you may be going into this with very little understanding of how the process works, and so you are relying on whoever it is that you're working with to try to help guide you through that
Yeah.
process. What about an employer who's just starting out? Like if you were giving advice to somebody who is saying, "Look, I'm thinking about getting involved in the temporary foreign worker program," who would be maybe the first resource that you would recommend that they reach out to?
Yeah, so I would actually suggest that they do their best to familiarize themselves as much as possible with the program themselves.
Mm,
And so I would say the government websites have actually been steadily improving in terms of how much information is available. And so sometimes the issue is people immediately say, I don't have time for this, and they just hire somebody to do everything. And so as part of the process of hiring a temporary foreign worker, you're supposed to think through like your succession plan. Okay, so that when this person is done, then what? Are you going to recruit from an equity deserving group? Are you going to work in partnership with a community college? Are you going to do all kinds of different things to kind of plan ahead long term? And so if you do that yourself, then okay, you have your own plan, and it's a plan that'll work for your company. If you hire like an agency, the solution is probably going to be something that involves the agency working with you for a very long time.
right.
And sometimes that'll be facilitating temporary foreign workers working through one of the immigration pilot programs and becoming Canadian citizens eventually. Most likely it'll be something that you have a long and financially lucrative relationship with that organization.
Right. So you have to keep coming back to them over and over. They're a permanent fixture
Yeah.
going forward rather than a temporary advisor or assister to get you through the process.
Yeah. Sometimes. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. So we've talked a little bit about things that employers can do on their end. I know a lot of what your book talks about is as how can we improve the program
Mhm.
overall. Clearly, as we've talked about, the open versus closed work permits is a huge deal. You'd put significant emphasis on that, and a lot of the interviews that I've read since your book came out that you've done, talking about how this is an area where change is sorely needed. Um, what about other things that could be done aside from changing the kind of the type of work permits that we're talking about? Is there anything else that you could see having a really positive impact on this program?
Yeah, so I think the monitoring and the enforcement needs to be improved significantly. So you'll notice, like, if you go to their website, you can actually see listed by name all the companies that have been audited and found to have some kind of problem in terms of compliance with the program. And so you will see, like, it grows a little bit every. There's less monitoring during COVID.
Right.
People were limited in some ways. But you can also see that, like, as a fraction of the users of the program, it's really quite small. And so I did speak to some companies who had been audited, and that was an important process, like just like with Revenue Canada, right? For sure. But at the same time, it would be, I think, useful if there would be some kind of follow-up
Hmm.
with people once they have exited the program. And so either their work permit has ended and they've returned to their country of origin, or if they've transitioned and they've become permanent residents, just ask them at that point, what happened? What was your experience? Because I spoke to so many people who were so reluctant to report any misconduct. And I think it's kind of predictable, unfortunately. And so to counteract that, I think extra effort needs to be undertaken just to really check that people's rights are being respected.
Right.
And then on the other side, I mean, this program needs to be way quicker. It's no program, holy moly. Yeah. People wait months to find out. They don't know what's going to happen. Like, it's just really difficult. If you're trying to hire someone, usually you need them yesterday.
Right.
So if you're waiting months for someone, like it's just not going to work, like, for your business, right?
Right.
So yeah, they need to speed that up as much as they can.
Right, right. So just kind of in the same lines, do you see this program? I know we saw obviously during the pandemic when immigration was just not really a thing that was happening. We
Yeah.
didn't see the program being used very much. But do you see that this is something that is going to continue to increase in use? I know you had mentioned that a very limited number of employers who are utilizing it now, but do you see that changing in the future? Do you see that this is going to become a more perhaps common thing that we see employers taking advantage of?
Yeah, so I think if you go back over the last like 20 years or so, it's this constant kind of back and forth between, like, we're making it really restrictive and very few people can be part of this program. And then now it's open. And so sometimes they'll say, okay, if you're in this occupation, you cannot, or if unemployment rate in your region is this high, then you cannot. And then it kind of relaxes, and then it gets all, and then it kind of goes in.
Right.
So, I have a feeling that part will continue. So
Okay.
it's been going through the roof in the last 2 years or so. And unemployment rate, it's still pretty low. It's around, I think, 5.5 these days. I think if we are actually in a more obvious recession, that might change. I think there's been a lot of public discussion about housing. And I think, I mean, we haven't talked about it, but housing is also a bit of an issue in terms of the demand for the temporary foreign worker program. In that, if you are a business that's in a remote area and there's housing is really expensive and you cannot find people locally, then probably you're going to start using the temporary foreign worker program and then provide housing for those people. And yeah, it's an issue that a lot of Canadians are very concerned about. And so I think we'll see some ripples on the temporary foreign worker program as well.
Okay, interesting. And I imagine if is because you were mentioning the kind of flopping back and forth where the requirements can be really strict and then a little bit looser, is that if they can find a consistency that and the program becomes more accessible, then we may see the use increase as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. No, that's really, I mean, I feel like we could talk about temporary foreign workers forever.
Yes.
This is such an interesting topic, but this is really just one kind of non-standard worker, if we're kind of using that term from your book. We also have, contractors, consultants, agency workers, employees with disabilities. So a lot of categories of other workers or non-standard workers. So what is something that you or some things that you see as being common for all categories or these categories of workers that they all might share?
Yeah, so I'm generally interested in my research on the experiences of workers who do not fit the mold. And so a lot of times companies will have in mind kind of an employee who's full-time, permanent, has always worked at the company, always will work at the company, and like their policies, their practices, they're all designed with this guy in mind. And I mean, that's great if you're him, but most people are not, right? So we use the phrase non-standard in my field, organizational behavior, but I almost wonder, well, who is standard these
Right.
days, right?
Who is
Like,
this guy?
yeah, exactly. So I'd say most of us don't really fit the mold anymore. And organizations need to be agile, like they really need to adapt to that if they're going to be able to keep employees and keep the best employees and have the best outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. And so have you seen an increase in the use of I guess these non-standard workers that, I mean, because if we were to look back, 50 years, we might see a lot of the in office 9 to 5, hired full-time indefinite term worker, and the landscape is certainly shifted, right? We're certainly seeing more type of these kind of non-standard workers, such
Yeah.
as contractors and agency employees. So if you notice that uptick as well, that we're just seeing this being more common.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, if you go back 20 years ago, part-time was a big deal, or
Right.
job sharing, right? And then the idea of remote work, like even 5 years ago, there's so much
Right.
pushback against it. And then the pandemic happens, and then all of a sudden, yeah, we realize, yeah, actually, yeah, people can be remote. And so I think that is just going to continue, right? Like, I think gig work is with us, here to stay, right? Hybrid, remote work, same thing, right? So all the contractors, like it is just continuing. So
Absolutely. And I think some of it is individual driven, right? Some of these are individuals who realize they don't want to work the 9 to 5 in office permanent employee kind of lifestyle. They want to have more flexibility and more freedom, but it's also driven from the company side.
yeah.
So what are some of the reasons why an employer would want to hire like an agency employee instead of bringing on a full-time permanent employee?
Oh, it's interesting you ask. Yeah. So for many companies, they are looking to cut costs, right? And so they think, okay, I don't have to pay benefits, right? And I only need to get them for that time that I need them for, right? So surely this must be cheaper.
Mm.
Um, what we found in my research, though, is that like sometimes you just get what you pay for. And
Right.
so, no, really. So, like, there's often like startup costs and then switching costs and transaction costs. And you might even have like an agency fee that you're paying. So, like, there's a lot of kind of like other costs. Even like you might be thinking, okay, I don't have to train somebody. I'm just going to get a contractor who already knows what they're doing. That's going to be a more expensive contractor. And even still, you're going to have to train them on some things about like your system and your requirements and what you are looking for. And maybe they're not an employee in that they're not in your org chart. Because that would make them an employee legally, right? But you're still going to have to spend some time with them, checking them, making sure that they're hitting their milestones, all these things. Like, it's not as hands-off as maybe we like to think it will be. So like there's still costs involved. So what we found is the best arrangement, if you're going to use some kind of temp or contract, or if you can arrange some kind of temp to perm arrangement where they start out temporary, but then they get more hours, and then eventually they're part of your permanent staff. Usually that works out pretty well.
I think that's really interesting. And it kind of mirrors what you were saying about getting involved in the temporary foreign worker program as well. It's almost like just being more intentional overall, like thinking more long term, it's funny because it might be the opposite of what most organizations are doing. If they're reaching out to an agency, it's like, I need, like you were saying, I need workers yesterday, and that's all they're thinking. They're thinking in the now. But I think you're right that there is certainly an advantage, maybe even a cost savings, if you just get right down to it, to thinking more long term about how these individuals are going to be part of the organization, if they're ever going to be part of the organization. Because there's definitely times when it's just a project, it's just a one-off. maybe it makes sense that that's just all it is. It's not that deep. But
Yeah,
there's a lot of times when that's not the case. So, you've got agency workers who have been working with the same company for 20 years, but
yeah.
they're still an outsider. They're still an agency worker. And you're right. I think in a situation like that, the company may have actually spent more money than they would have if they'd brought that in as an internal position.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you kind of drill down and you find out like the reasons behind why some people are on temporary contract, it's surprising. Sometimes I talked to one organization where they could hire agency workers out of their office supply budget. And then their headcount was officially lower. So their kind of net sales per person looked pretty good because on paper they had fewer employees. They just had a bunch of temps that were being
Right.
paid out of a different budget, right?
Oh,
So,
interesting. Getting a little creative there with the numbers.
so yeah, exactly.
Interesting. Okay, I know we're almost at time actually already, but I wanted to talk to you a little bit about another concept that you talk about, which is this idea of knowledge hiding. And I want to ask you to give us an idea of what does this mean when you're describing knowledge hiding?
Oh, yeah. So this is something that as soon as I describe it, people usually have experienced this at some point. It's this idea where maybe you ask a colleague or someone you work with for advice or help with something or some information, and they say to you, "Oh, I'll get back to you." And they never do, right? Or they say, "Oh, it's really just easy. You'll figure it out." And it's not. And that's why you ask them. Or sometimes they have like a real reason why you can't be told, and okay, you might accept that, right? So yeah, so those are three different strategies that people tend to use when they're hiding knowledge from each other. And for the most part, organizations try to discourage this, but it's not like they can force people to share their knowledge. So it persists. It keeps on happening.
Right, which is really interesting is we had talked about this during our prep meeting was that when I first read knowledge hiding, I was thinking about it from the employer perspective of withholding information from employees, even just
Yeah,
at the level of don't talk about what you're getting paid,
yeah,
right? Like as an
yeah,
example. And
yeah.
so when we were talking about this and you were saying, "No, I'm actually talking about it from the employee perspective," my mind was blown. But you're absolutely right. Like that is absolutely something I think everybody has had experience with of somebody keeping something close to their chest because they don't want necessarily want to share that
Yeah.
information. So I guess my question for you from an employer perspective is why would you want to encourage knowledge sharing? Like why would that be valuable to your organization?
Yeah, so it mostly comes down to efficiency and productivity, right? So if people are just really kind of doing their own thing and not sharing with other people, there's going to be a lot of reinventing the wheel. And so people will have to start over from scratch. And it's a lot of wasted time when
Mm,
maybe it didn't have to be that way. And so the other issue is people can start to feel a little bit alienated from their coworkers, right? Because you're asking for help, it's for work, right? You just want to do a good job. You all work there. And if people are refusing that, it's really easy to feel alienated from your coworkers and like they're not supporting you,
right.
right? And so why would you not just explore your other options where maybe people would help you if you needed help? So
Right.
yeah, and I think there's also like there's the relationship element to it. There's the time element to it. I think just the ideas tend to be better too if people can shed light on maybe a challenge they faced, how they overcame it, right? It's not the sort of thing that are maybe easy to explain. Like it's usually like, but it's those complicated things where if somebody, you can just talk it through with somebody, that's the real value added. So
Right. Right. Even just getting another perspective, a
yes,
fresh perspective on a process or a policy. I mean, that can have huge value.
yeah. Yeah. And sometimes it's even just defining what the problem is.
Right.
So someone has observed this and they think this is the right approach. And can someone kind of, I don't know, take a look and say what you think is going on here? Or do you see this too? Like, yeah. So
Yeah.
when knowledge sharing really happens, it's great. And then when the hiding is a problem, it's a real problem.
Absolutely. I can definitely see that. And as you said, sometimes there's valid reason for knowledge hiding if you've got confidentiality issues that you need to be concerned about. But in terms of motivation as to why employees engage in knowledge hiding outside of circumstances like that, I mean, I could see a lot of it being, I want to be the expert in this topic. I need to show my value by making it clear no one else can do this. So how do employers combat that? How do they encourage knowledge sharing in the workplace?
Yeah, so when it comes down to it, a lot of it is that relationship. So sometimes the supervisor or the employer, they can maybe set a better example in terms of they make information available when it's possible. If someone lent a hand on a project, acknowledging this, kind of providing some recognition that someone contributed. Compensation structures can make a difference too, so that you're not fighting against each other or ranking people about kind of first, second, third, you're fired.
Right.
Then there's sort of subtle things that kind of can create maybe just a bit more of a team environment. When I talk to people about knowledge hiding that they've engaged in, often they will say it comes down to trust, actually. And so maybe they don't trust the motives of the person who is asking. They don't trust how that person will be able to use that information. So sometimes the organization can improve the knowledge sharing just by providing opportunities to build trust among the employees. And so in a remote work environment, sometimes that can be a little bit tricky if people don't actually know each other. They don't have a chance to talk about pets, hobbies, the weather, tie cats, all these things, right? And so in the absence of that, like sometimes you just don't know how to interpret a request. And so,
Right.
but if it's somebody you've known for a while, even if it's just up to the water cooler, waiting for the elevator, sometimes you give a little bit more benefit of the doubt and at least have that conversation rather than just like deleting their email or ignoring them on the Slack channel.
Right, right, absolutely. So I guess it's another example. It goes back to something we've been talking about throughout this whole conversation of having a more involved approach rather than just setting a policy and forgetting it, assuming everybody's following it, not actually taking the steps to ensure that this is the reality within your workplace. This is the culture that you're fostering.
Yeah, absolutely. I think good working environments don't happen spontaneously. I think sometimes it feels that way. It just feels like, oh, we've just happened to have a great climate or a great culture here. No, I think there's a lot of intentional decisions that have to be made carefully along the way.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Catherine, for joining us. This was so interesting, so informative. We covered a lot of topics, and I feel like we could just keep talking. I think we're definitely going to have you back on the show at another time to talk about all the other areas that your research touches. So, but thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed it.
Wonderful. All right, that's a wrap for season 6, episode 7 of Fire Away. Thank you to everyone for tuning in, and thanks again to Dr. Catherine Connelly for joining me today. Past episodes can be found on YouTube, on our website, and archived on Facebook. And if you like our page or subscribe to our channel, you will receive notifications when the episodes are live. Our next episode will be airing on September 19th, which will be here before you know it. At Rudner Law, we want people to treat their employment relationships as legal relationships and make informed decisions rather than assumptions. I invite you to keep up to date on employment law issues by following us on Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn and TikTok. We are now on there too. Liking our Facebook page and subscribing to our YouTube channel, as well as subscribing to our newsletter. But as we always say, none of that replaces legal advice tailored to your specific circumstances. As we love to say, if you think you may need an employment lawyer, you probably do. So feel free to reach out to us. Thanks to Rob, Rebecca, and Mark for helping put the show together as always, and we'll see you next time.